Hello again and welcome back. You're with India Global Week. I'm Ben Thompson and I'm going to take you through our next session, a session that will have relevance for all sorts of different reasons, and we'll explain that in just a moment. But quite clearly right now, given the ongoing pandemic of COVID, the looming economic crisis, you would imagine that global cooperation would be high on the agenda, that cooperation between international organizations and countries would be a priority. But it seems that that is not the case. The institutions that are tasked with dealing with those issues, those problems, appear to be more fragile than ever before. So in this next section, we're going to explore why those institutions seemingly are fraying at the seams, and what is causing the tension, and perhaps how that might be resolved. And I'm delighted to welcome a rather esteemed panel of guests to talk me through some of the issues and debate why that might be happening. Please welcome the panel for this next session. His Excellency Syed Akbaruddin, who's a former Indian ambassador to the United Nations. He's got more than 3 decades as a diplomat, specializing in multilateral diplomacy and an expert on West Asia. Also with us, Ashok Malik from the Ministry of External Affairs for the Indian government. He's a policy advisor in the ministry and was previously press secretary to the President of India as his principal speechwriter and spokesperson. Also with us, Richard Moore, Director General for Political Affairs at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It's a role he was appointed to in 2018, and he's previously served as British Ambassador to Turkey, as well as previous postings in Vietnam, Pakistan and Malaysia. And also with us, Tanya Spisbah, who's Director of the Australia-India Institute. She works closely with the Australian government negotiating MOUs on healthcare, as well as free trade agreements with China, South Korea and the ASEAN bloc. Welcome to you all. Good afternoon, or good evening to you all. It's great to see you as part of this debate and this discussion. Syed Akbaruddin, I'm going to start with you, and I wonder whether you would assess my introduction. Is it fair to say those multilateral institutions are losing relevance at a time when we need them most?
Well, the COVID-19 crisis has put all of us under a magnifying glass, and human frailties of institutions, organizations are pretty evident. And sadly so, in the case of international organizations, they do not appear to be fit for the purpose of handling 21st century crisis. They've performed below par when most needed. Many of them have been missing, except on the fringes. Some seem to be sick, some are ailing, some are hanging to dear life by a mere thread. While their structures remain intact, the limitations of their capacities, the inadequacies of their authority, and the diminishing roles of their executives is pretty evident. So if I would like to sum up, I would say yes, multilateral organizations have been a collateral damage of COVID-19, but this was in the making for some time. What has happened is the shortcomings are now visible, and obviously we need to address them.
Ashok Malik, let me bring you in at this point, because I wonder, given that statement that yes, they are losing relevance, who is to blame for it? Is it the institutions themselves that have failed to keep up with a changing world, or is it the national governments who need to support but also to rely on these institutions for how they operate on the world stage?
Well, it's a combination. You have had cases of countries that have sought to game the international, the multilateral system to their advantage, while other countries have not responded as strategically. But in many senses, as Master Akbaruddin pointed out, the multilateral system also needs an upgrade. Institutions that were set up in the middle of the 20th century, at the end of the Second World War, are simply not appropriate to this century in their current form. In India, we've often spoken about the UN Security Council and the need for a larger, expanded permanent membership. But more than that, if you look at something like the COVID crisis, the first full-fledged 21st century crisis of this nature, is health security a concern appropriate for the UN Security Council to discuss? The fact that we're even asking that question tells you that there's something wrong with how we define security. In the previous century, we had a non-proliferation treaty for nuclear weapons, an NPT, as it's called. And India did have problems and does have problems with the NPT, but that's a separate issue. But the principal concern today is not a nuclear strike, it's a cyber strike. Do we have an NPT equivalent, or are we even talking about one for cyber warfare? So there are 21st century concerns, issues, definitions, and realities, or even geographies, where the Indo-Pacific matters today in a way it did not in 1945 when the transatlantic space mattered. These are issues that will require institutions to be rebuilt, upgraded, reformed, and resourced.
Richard, I see you nodding along there. Richard Moore, Director General for Political Affairs at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. As we've heard from Ashok, that these institutions are no longer fit for purpose. Do you agree? Richard, I'm hoping you're able to hear me.
Ben, thank you. Thanks for the question. And very nice to see some familiar faces on the screen. We are unable to travel to Delhi. It's very nice to be able to commune virtually. Look, I think, as in many respects, COVID-19 has been an accentuator. It's not been a kind of revolutionary thing, although it is unprecedented. What it's done is accentuate issues which were already there. And that is very true of the multilateral system, I think. I also think that it's way too early to draw conclusions about what the impact of COVID-19 will be on the multilateral system, because we all know that we are not done. And that we will probably inevitably have a second wave or whatever. So we'll have to have this seminar over again in a year or two's time, I think, to reflect back on what had been the really significant impact on the multilateral system. But I think it is fair I would draw a distinction between, on the one hand, if you like, the political face of multilateralism, which I think it's hard to deny has had a bad crisis. UN Security Council was only very belatedly able to even issue a resolution calling for a ceasefire. It took an age, and I pay tribute to my French colleagues for sticking at it and eventually getting there. That wasn't great. We've clearly got a lot of US-China sniping going on. Some of that gets diverted onto key international bodies. WHO, of course, has been perhaps most in the sights. G7, we stuttered a bit, again, in full honesty with you. I think we've now got going in a helpful way, but it stuttered a bit fast. G20 likewise. And even the EU, a club of which we are no longer members, but they took a while to get themselves together on this. So I think that's been difficult. I think if you look at the multilateral organizations themselves, yes, they've made missteps in this completely unprecedented environment, but actually they've kept delivering. And that's not been too bad. WHO, clearly there is controversy about the early days and the interactions with Beijing, but fundamentally I think the WHO has done a pretty damn good job. And that is true of other parts of the multilateral system which are actually doing work, deliberately, not on the ground. So I think that's where I am. But we will see whether we get through the rest of this, get through a US presidential election, the rhetorical headwinds that will come with that, and then we'll look and see where the multilateral system is settled.
Thank you for that, Richard. Let me bring in Tanya Spisbah, Director of the Australia India Institute. Tanya, is the danger actually in all of this, not necessarily that they've lost relevance, but that we've maybe taken them for granted? We just assume that they're there and they will step in when we need them. And actually something like the COVID crisis has proved that actually when we were most in need, they maybe weren't there.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, the idea of relevance of institutions, because the first question, of course, is relevance to whom or what. So as far as some of the previous comments have been made regarding, 21st century threats being perhaps cybersecurity rather than nuclear, and do we have those kinds of deals, certainly we can question the relevance to issues. Certainly we do have architecture there. And as we talk about how we might strengthen institutions, strengthen representation, think about their pertinence to issues, I guess the question in my mind is the one that you're raising, which is, even if we did all that, would that make a difference to how we're engaging with these institutions today? So obviously we saw that in 2016 we started the Brexit movement. 2017 we saw President Trump get voted in with a dismantling agenda, I think it's fair to say, of international institutions. We've seen him now taking steps to withdraw from the WHO, certainly crippling the WTO, certainly withdrawing from Paris. There's been a number of very obvious and clear steps that have predated COVID. And the question in my mind is why? So even if we've strengthened the institutions to date, Shashi Tharoor just before this talk spoke about strengthening institutions even more over national states, who admitted it was a tough sell. Even if all that were to happen, what has changed now? And in my view, we have our commitment is wavering for international institutions. Our respect has declined. In some ways, our skin has thickened, and not for the better. There was a time when global shaming actually meant something for nations, and now it's with great pride that some nations, like certainly Donald Trump's United States, will say, well, we reject the philosophy of globalism and embrace what they call patriotism. My personal sense is that we have deeper issues that are cracking the international infrastructure, and they probably lie in inequality and a conflation between institutions and globalisation, where globalisation is blamed for the offshoring of opportunity, and then there's a conflation where we blame the international institutions for those, whether or not true, the consequences that leaders would have us believe.
Really interesting points there, Tanya, that you raised. Syed, let me bring you in again on this, because Richard there talking about the need for these organisations to work together for the common good, and Tanya touching on the fact of, there are so many differences now that even on a world stage, people are no longer shamed into action by the collective action of a multilateral group. I wonder, when we talk about the common good and these organisations working for the common good, is there still such a thing as the common good?
Well, that's the underpinning of all international cooperation, whether multilateral or bilateral or plurilateral. What is now different is that we have moved from are certainly moving from an age of cooperation to one of competition and perhaps even confrontation. And that's why we are seeing some of these institutions not measuring up, because they were built with the goals of working in a cooperative manner. What we today have is two of the largest countries pulling in different directions. We have the US, which has walked out of, by my reckoning, 12 multilateral or plurilateral arrangements or treaties. And this is not a small number. On the other hand, we have another country, and this is China, trying to work or game the system to the detriment of the others. So obviously, we have a conflict of interest there, and therefore you are not going to get the cooperation that was underpinning the plans that multilateral organizations stood for. However, that said, let me just make one point to add to what Ashok said, and that is the problems of modernity require us to cooperate. He mentioned cyber, but I could mention several others: environment, climate change, data, geoengineering. What about unsecured spaces, space, polar regions? All of these cry for solutions of problems without passports. And we will require that cooperation. Whether these are the systems that will lead us there, whether we require new systems, is the only issue at debate. We will require international cooperation. Countries like us will certainly require more and more of cooperation.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that point in just a moment, but let's just talk about that idea that as countries pull out of these agreements, namely, as you've touched on, China and the US, it then becomes a race to the bottom, because to protect their own interests, every country thinks, I've got to do this on my own. I can't rely on those institutions to help me anymore. Ashok, is that the case, that this is just a race to the bottom? As soon as one pulls out, all will pull out?
I don't think that is really a feasible situation, because there are two things here. Globalization as a process is under some stress, but we've had previous waves of globalization as well. And each wave of globalization, when it recedes, leaves the world much more interconnected than previously. And that will happen to this wave as well. We are going to remain very interconnected in ways we weren't 20 or 30 years ago. If you dismantle WHO, you will need to rebuild WHO 2.0 tomorrow morning. Which is why, when I spoke at the beginning, I spoke about both reforming multilateral institutions and resourcing them, and making them compatible with 21st century needs. WHO has not dealt with a pandemic of this magnitude and nature in its lifetime. It was set up 30 years after the Spanish flu. It has international health regulations, IHR reporting standards that are required of national governments. Are these enough? Are these maintained by the by the national governments? Do we need to make them stronger? These are questions we need to debate and discuss. And that will be part of the process of reforming or restructuring WHO. That would also require resourcing. That will also require more commitment from national governments and more money. So I don't think walking away from institutions is the answer, but institutions will require to be tweaked and in some cases overhauled.
Richard, is part of the problem here the fact that these organisations are too often the whipping boy? They're an easy person to blame in politics when things don't quite go according to plan, or maybe the outlook is a bit tougher than maybe a government would have us believe. It's easy to blame these multilateral institutions, isn't it?
Sure, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true. I mean, let me just pick up a couple of other points and I'll come back and address that. I mean, I totally agree that we need to address these common issues. I mean, it's not even you use the term a race to the bottom. It's a race to extinction if we don't manage to do that. On climate change, it's as stark as that. If and we have a particular responsibility, of course, this coming year because of being hosts of COP26. But if we can't get our act together in a multilateral way on that issue, we will fail. And that means not just doing it with like-minded, and increasingly one is seeing a more fragmented thing where we have driven perforce into creating groupings to try and get stuff done, particularly because of the blockages that one encounters at the Security Council. But that's no substitute for genuine global action. You can't find a like-minded group to do climate change. It has to involve China, for example. Of course, it has to involve giants like India and other countries as well. But it really has to involve China, otherwise we cannot succeed. So I would say that.
But Richard, just to interrupt on that point. I mean, if China doesn't come to the table and doesn't want to play ball with something like that, where does that leave the idea of collective effort? Because it's all well and good smaller nations maybe clubbing together to sort it out, but you still need the likes of the United States and China and India to be part of it, to lead it.
You do. So the short answer is, if we can't do that, we're in trouble. And so we must do it. It's an imperative. There is no greater imperative than saving the planet. So I think, in the end, we will have to make the compromises required to do that. We will have to, of course, accommodate perfectly justified demands from countries like India for a greater say in the international system. UK, of course, is all in favour of reforming the Security Council and including India in it as a permanent member. We're going to have to find a way through that, but I have to say it's not looking brilliant at the moment, and I don't think COVID is going to change the game on that. Sadly, I don't see some great reshaping of the international order. But I do think there's a real choice for countries like the UK and India, and we are leading the way a bit on this. And that is that when you have concerns, as Ashok points out, about particular organizations, and some of them, we, for example, have real issues with the ICC on a few issues. We're not uncritical of what WHO did early on. WTO needs reform badly. All of that is true, but our choice is to stay in and fight for that reform and change it. And one of the things which has been difficult for us, I think, is that when we see the country in the United States, which is the traditional champion of the multilateral system, stepping away from those institutions, it's very difficult for the rest of us to make up that deficit. We can do it to a degree. We can step in and increase funding with the number 2 funder of the WHO. We'll put more in. We'll organize a Gavi summit. We'll do that. But we need the US leadership. And that means that, A, we need to try and persuade them to come back in. And it does mean that issue of reform is really important. We can't ignore it. I mean, one of the reasons why America has got itself into the place it has is because it feels that some of the calls it made for reform in these international institutions was simply ignored.
Yeah, and that very neatly gets me back to my original question, which, and we'll move on beyond that in a second. But Richard, that idea of a multilateral organisation being the place to blame, the whipping boy in all of this, and you're right to talk about if you want reform, then you've got to reform it from within. So if you look at the EU, for example, the UK is saying, well, no, we're not going to reform it from within. We're going to leave.
Yeah, look. I know there's always a great irony for the Brits as we go and wax eloquent about the joys of multilateralism having left the EU, but and I do not want to rerun that particular campaign. There are particular and very British reasons why we have chosen to leave the EU, and they are wrapped up in our sense of sovereignty and our sense of identity as a nation. But what it hasn't done is dampened our desire to cooperate internationally, including, of course, with EU partners from outside in, but in all these other bodies that we are a member of, whether it's G7 or G20 or the UN or, you name it. So, yeah, I mean, I take the point, but that is for very particular British reasons.
Tanya, now I know your job involves a lot of negotiating with different governments, trying to bring them to the table to try to get compromise on certain things, whether those are FTAs, for example. Talk to me about how difficult it is to persuade governments right now to put aside national interest and think about that common good.
So first of all, I should clarify, I was a former diplomat with the Australian government. I'm currently the director of the Australia-India Institute, so I no longer do free trade agreement negotiations and representation. However, having had that experience and having negotiated, for example, the environmental goods list within APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, I can tell you that these things are certainly challenging, because certainly while we might agree on the philosophies, there are always, as everyone on this panel would know, and I'm sure many in the audience, there is always politicking, right down to what is an environmental good, whether or not it is dual use. And I have to say, one official, I won't say which country, but maybe people know, very cleverly said that even a solar panel could be used for skiing and therefore was dual use. So that's the kind of level of, ridiculousness you can get in a negotiating room. Where I'd like to go with this, though, is who are the leaders? We keep talking about the United States, in the American century, if you like, the 20th century, and we're lamenting the fact that we're not stepping up to the plate in this part of the 21st century. So how do we then move near? What's our diplomatic innovation? We've spoken about bringing smaller states and how that might not work, but we've also acknowledged that we're now in a multipolar world rather than a bipolar world. Yet every time we talk about international negotiation, we flip back into bipolarity, US or China. So I guess my question would be, if we want to embrace multipolarity, how do we do that with diplomatic innovation? Now, obviously, including the United States, there is one group in the Quad, in the Indo-Pacific, which has Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, originally set up to look at tsunamis, but now looking at very live issues in the Asia Pacific, including the South China Sea, and discussing a podcast with Vietnam and Indonesia, having been part of those discussions as well. Perhaps one could think about, the 20th century being that of middle powers, where you have a very hefty India. If you think about the beginning of 2020, India called for the first extraordinary meeting of the virtual G20. India established SARC discussions and in the first 10 million for a fund for COVID testing in the South Asia region. India spoke to NAM, Prime Minister Modi, for the first time addressing the non-aligned movement of more than 120 countries, calling for a more, human-centric commitment to multilateralism. He then reached out with a number of bilateral calls, including to Macron and Merkel, and in each of those bilateral phone calls, spoke about a human-centric multilateralism and a commitment to these things. I would also credit India with having established the International Solar Alliance together with France. And I don't say that because I think it's as significant an organisation as the United Nations or others, but I raise it because I credit the ISA with really breaking through some of the difficult discussions, that north-south divide that we often get in international negotiations on issues like climate change. So until Paris, until the ISA, the common mantra was that of common but differentiated responsibility, with developing and least developed countries taking huge amounts of responsibility on the ground that they're simply not responsible. What the ISA has done, and what Prime Minister Modi is behind, is championing a sharing of green technology transfer and green finance to say, well, we can step up to the plate. Let's make sure there's equitable sharing of resources to ensure that we can step up to the plate. That type of thing is diplomatic innovation, that is game-changing, and that is what we should be doing in the 21st century.
Tanya, thank you for that. Really fascinating. Ashok, I want to bring you back in here because you talked earlier about these institutions not being built around the structures on which we are now focusing, be those technology or others. Is there also a danger that political might used to be measured around defence and about military prowess and about security, and now it's about so much more, particularly when it comes to private money as well? We see huge organisations, corporations around the world holding just as much power as national governments in some cases, and there are no institutions really that hold those to account.
What you're suggesting is quite sort of astute, because if you look at many public goods, both nationally and internationally, they are now provided by, frankly, non-governmental organizations or international NGOs or private sector corporations that are outside state control. And, well, there's nothing quite wrong with that, but these institutions don't always realize that they are providing quasi or undertaking quasi-state international architecture. My contention is not that we need to dismantle or completely overhaul or completely get rid of these institutions. These multilateral institutions are very necessary and very needed. They are under stress, but they are needed. However, they do need to be made compatible with today's needs, with security concerns that have changed enormously. We didn't have concepts of human security, health security, or even cyber security, of course, being so salient or even existing in 1945. Today we do. When the UN Security Council was created in 1945, its essential concern was keeping the peace in Europe, which had seen 2 devastating wars in 30 years. Today, the geography of security has changed, and so have the domains. No one's talking about territorial wars, other than in some parts of our neighborhood. But you're talking about cyber warfare, environmental damage, health security, and pathogens that can devastate populations. All of these have to come into our global multilateral discourse in a way that they are not today. And many of our institutions are not structured to accommodate these discussions.
And Syed, I mean, then given what Ashok says, it's about rebuilding around new structures and new priorities as far as the world is concerned. Do you also feel that perhaps these things are cyclical, whereby not only do we take them for granted, but we go through periods of breaking down barriers, breaking down walls, and then, as we've seen of late, those barriers start to go back up. We start building walls again. And these things are cyclical. We need these organizations to break down the barriers that are erected every few years over the course of a cycle.
Did you ask me?
Yes, please, Syed, if you would.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, they are cyclical in nature because institutions actually are a reflection of the world as it was when they are created. Nobody foresees well into the future. And so, in some ways, the UN and its multilateral agencies or the UN system has done a fantastic job because it has proved to be resilient. Its predecessor lasted only 20 years, the League of Nations. But that said, that's not an answer to the felt needs of people who have great hope in them, because it's good for intellectuals to say that yes, they're cyclical, we will overcome them. But on the one hand, we see people who are used to upgrades of an iPhone. It takes 5 minutes to upgrade an iPhone. So people have got used to quick decision making, faster action, and it is going to be difficult. And I'm not saying that everyone be like the iPhone, but it is important for institutions to move with the spirit of the times. And for that spirit of the times certainly requires much more willingness to adapt and adjust. That adjustment can, as some have mentioned here, can be around issue-based coalitions who could start off that discussion. They need not be the endpoints, but they can be the catalyst. I heard about the International Solar Alliance that Prime Minister Modi and the French President started. We have another initiative which the UK and India are working on, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Again, it's specific, it's issue-based, it impacts everybody, it requires cross-boundary cooperation, and when it is ready, it could move to a broader platform for legitimacy. But we will need to work first in smaller groups, get everything in order, and then move to the larger groups. But the problem now is we will need small groups which are more diverse than they were before. It was okay for the G7 once upon a time to be the catalyst for change. Today, there are new countries or new countries with capabilities, desire and willingness to be helpful in that process, whether it's Brazil, whether it is India, there could be many others, South Africa, etc. All of them need to be part of the Ginger Group. Australia, there are many such countries.
Yeah, and Tanya, do you agree that actually these organizations may be much smaller in scale? Certainly initially, we will have many more of them as our interests are more diverse. There are smaller organizations who will tackle more localized issues, more localized problems.
I think it depends on the issue and what we're trying to achieve. So I definitely take Syed's point. I think the CDRI is a fantastic initiative announced in the margins of UNGA last year, but I note that a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure in a way is about adaptation rather than mitigation of climate change. So from an adaptation perspective, yes, you could have a coalition of willing countries sharing technology together to create climate adaptive technology for infrastructure, which could help you for earthquakes, for tsunamis, for cyclones, weather conditions with extreme cold and so on. But it's not really going to help you, as we said earlier in this panel, address climate change itself. So in terms of actual mitigation, we do need big countries. China has in fact been quite committed on climate change, and India is certainly demonstrating itself to also be very committed on climate change. As far as its commitments for solar energy goes, it's 1.78 gigawatt commitment of solar energy by 2022, and even more stronger commitments by 2030. And so I think for that bigger actual mitigation aspect, how do we avoid the race to extinction, as I think was said by Richard, or mutually assured destruction, which was our 20th century language for nuclear, but still applies quite strongly to climate change. No, we need everyone. We need a stronger multilateral body. The question is, how do we get that, and how do we reinstill confidence and trust?
Richard, just a final word from you, if I can, on the dominance of China and the United States, this race now for supremacy. And there is a danger that all other nations are caught up in that race for supremacy, caught in the middle. Where do we all figure, be it the UK, Australia or India?
Well, look, it's one of those things people often pose the question. At one level, of course, it's an absurd question. We're an ally of the United States, so we're forced to choose. Of course, it's the United States. But we, like many other countries, are determined not to be forced to choose because for all those reasons we've talked about, with the need to engage China, we're having a very tough period. All of us are very tough with China because of behaviors in Hong Kong at the moment. But that doesn't doesn't change the fact that in other fora, we need to cooperate with them. So we will continue, I think, as the UK, to push very hard for us to avoid that, and to, we'll see what happens over coming months and years in terms of how we manage this. But we do also need to be clear-sighted about some of the changes that China is trying to force on the international system. Syed mentioned some of those, and this links back into this issue of grand redesign of the 1945 system. I'm afraid I don't see on the agenda any time very soon. I mean, it should happen, but I just don't see the conditions being ready for that. But everyday multilateralism continues day to day. It's absolutely my life because the United Kingdom can't do a pile of things on their own. They need to be able to work with groupings. There are the big structural ones like NATO for our common defence, but for most things, exactly as Syed described, or maybe it was Ashok, forgive me, it's an issues-based thing where you put together a group to try and resolve an issue, and increasingly it's a values-based coalition. So if you look at some of the ways in which new standards have to be set around new technologies, new phenomena. Cyber has been mentioned, and there are others. China has a very particular agenda on that stuff, and they are trying to inject Xi Jinping thought into the multilateral system over and over again. Well, we are going to have to get smarter as a group of countries, perhaps in that sort of second rank, and named a few: UK, Australia, India, Korea, Japan, several of the Europeans. There are others that we put into this basket who have free societies, put a lot of stress on making sure that these new technologies can be harnessed for the good of all their people and not utilized for repressive ends. And therefore really work hard together to make sure that those key nodes of the international system are kept in the hands of people who believe in the same values that we do. And there are it's a mix and match thing. The Commonwealth has a role in this. It's very much a values-based organization for discussing some of these things around oceans, for example, and issues around small island states. And there'll be other groups where you will do other types of discussions. But I was very struck coming on my visit to Delhi, how much India is thinking about this issue, thinking about the Indian Ocean, thinking about the way in which it can cooperate with other countries in unusual ways, in ways that perhaps break away from its rather traditional orientation within the G77 framework. And I thought that was very fascinating. UK also trying to resolve its role in the world and where we go forward. So I see the UK-India partnership as being a pretty key one in a number of these areas. Thanks.
And what a perfect way to end the session. I certainly feel a bit more optimistic about all of this than when we began. I'm really grateful for you for the time that you've all spent with us this afternoon. Really grateful for your thoughts. So my thanks there to Syed, to Ashok, to Richard and to Tanya. We're going to take a short break here for India Global Week, about 15 minutes or so. So grab a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to continue with our conversation with Ravi Shankar after this short break. We'll see you very soon.